Question number 5. Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. When did he first become aware that there was an international glut of dairy products, and does he stand by his reported comments that he has no plans to take active steps to diversify the economy in response to falling dairy prices?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, probably with respect to the first question, around the same time as everyone else, one of the clear signals of expanded supply in the global dairy market was when prices started dropping in the GDT. With respect to diversifying the economy, I would say that, first of all, under the excellent leadership of the Honourable Stephen Joyce, the government's program through the business growth agenda is encouraging a range of industries to develop in New Zealand. And secondly, right now, I'd say the relative price signals for the dairy industry with respect to any other investment in New Zealand are probably doing a pretty good job of diversifying the economy.
Supplementary question, Mr
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Did he miss the Goldman Sachs report in July last year that said there was going to be a 5-year international dairy glut? Or, like his colleague, the Minister for Economic Development, did he just think that was a laughing matter at the time?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I'd be surprised if I hadn't read that particular piece of commentary. But of course, there's always a range of opinions in the market, and recent experience with the dairy price has been that almost all of that opinion has underestimated the extent of excess supply and therefore the short-term drop in the prices. But unlike the member, we have a positive outlook for the dairy industry in the future. Unlike the Labor Party, we don't believe New Zealand has far too much dairy and that the industry ought to shrink, which appears to be what that member thinks.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is he aware that dairy at 20% of New Zealand's exports represents the same percentage of exports as iron ore is for Australia? And given what has happened to the Australian economy, doesn't he think he should just be a little bit more energised in his response to the collapse in dairy prices?
Very energised.
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the fact is that if the dairy industry is 20% of exports, and actually it's a bit less than that, it's because it's been a successful, globally competitive industry. It would be a bit like saying, why doesn't New Zealand diversify from rugby? Because the All Blacks are too successful. We've got all our eggs in the All Black basket. The fact is, if it's a good performing industry, then we would hope that it would keep performing. And if you think that having too much dairy is a problem, look what happens when you have a bit too little.
Your question, Mr Speaker.
Order. Grant. Order. Grant Robertson, supplementary question.
Does he, therefore, in light of that answer, does he believe that today's forecast from the BNZ of a payout of $3.80 per kilo for 2015-16 and a downside scenario payment of $2.80 per kilo represents a serious problem for the health of the New Zealand economy? Or is it like John Key said on Monday, and it doesn't really affect 95% of people?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, of course it's of concern, but this is an industry which has characteristics the member wouldn't be familiar with because he's always worked in the public sector, and that is it has developed the resilience. It has developed the resilience and the flexibility to deal with commodity cycles. And unlike that member, we have confidence that the industry will deal with the cash flow problems, quite serious cash flow problems, that flow from these very low dairy prices. In any case, the lower exchange rate will cushion the effect of the dairy on the dairy industry, but also encourage the expansion of tourism, in particular, international education, underpin the profitability of meat and wool, horticulture, the film industry, all industries which are succeeding reasonably well at the moment.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is it correct that the NZX dairy futures today predict a further 16% drop in August to a US $1,550 a tonne price for milk solids, only $50 more than the price that would see a $2.80 a kilogram payout?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, that may be the case, and if that eventuality became a reality, of course that would be of concern. But the member seems to be suggesting that the New Zealand government can either take some action about the price, which it can't because it's a world price. It's not a Fonterra problem or a Fonterra price, it's a world price. And secondly, I would have thought that if the member's concerned about diversification in the New Zealand economy, then the lower the dairy price, the more likely you are to get diversification of investment into other sectors. That is pretty self-evident.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
So in light of that answer, can the Minister of Finance confirm that his only path to real diversification of the economy is the collapse of the dairy industry?
The Honourable Bill English.
No, Mr Speaker, I'm simply pointing out that unlike the Labor Party and the Greens, we're not pleased about low dairy prices. We actually like our dairy industry to be big and strong and successful, and in the long run we believe it will be. But alongside the market pricing, the Honourable Stephen Joyce is leading a program which is having a positive effect on diversifying the New Zealand economy. But the strongest signal for diversification is the uplift in profitability around tourism, around horticulture, around IT that is occurring because of the drop in the exchange rate over the last 2 or 3 months.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
How does he think the success of Stephen Joyce's great diversification strategy is reflected in the lowest levels of business confidence, consumer confidence, employer confidence that we have seen in New Zealand in many years? How's that successful strategy going?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, of course, prices go up and down, confidence goes up and down, often in relation to prices and in relation to what people are reading in the media about the prospects for the world economy and the New Zealand economy. Diversification amounts to people making risky investments in new industries or expanding industries, and unlike the member, they take a view longer than 2 or 3 months. In fact, some of those investments have to be 20-year investments. That's how a good economy runs.
Question number 6.